the recording button. And we are also, once we start the sessions, I'll turn on the sub captions that people can read that also once we start the first session. So I'm just going to let people in. So it's glad to see everybody today, and folks are joining us. We have 7 in the room, and I'm probably sure we'll get to what we've been getting to is 15 and 16. I did miss yesterday, so I apologize for that. As I was saying, I was teaching a class. Well, I had a class to teach that was happening at the same time, and though I have made every effort to try to figure it out, I have not figured out how to be in 2 places at the same time. And if you've got any tricks on doing that, let me know, but it just wasn't going to happen yesterday. So Lena Chowdhury was my pinch hitter, and I know it was a good session. I actually listened to some of the captions. I always like Michael Collins coming and sharing with us what's going on at the Institute for Economics and Peace, talking about the Global Peace Index. And I know a lot of you are using that, so I think that's great. And then Laura Azuri was somebody we hadn't had before because well, maybe I just wasn't focusing on refugee needs in the United States, but I wanted to at least have an organization come and talk about the types of things that are going on and the needs of refugees. And I don't know if in your own community you're dealing with refugee needs. So before we start, we have a few minutes. Let me go through these slides first. I always feel like compelled to kind of go through this. So this was last weekend. We are in the midst of this weekend. So we now will have Susan, Ash Carter, and Phil Collins, Susan Cushman, Ash Carter, and Phil Giddens, present. And then Ozzy Ale will talk at the second half. We'll talk about some of her work with Holocaust education. And she teaches at Queensborough Community College. And then after that, we have one more week. And we will, next weekend, we will have Michael Lodenthal talk about his work looking at terrorism, domestic terrorism in particular. Holly Rosewood will show a film, which I think is in the original schedule. I forget the name of it, but it has to do with refugees in the United States, I believe, from the Pulitzer Center. And Michael Schenk is going to talk about the work of the Carbon Neutral Alliance, the Cities Alliance. And then the last session next Saturday is going to be kind of non-scheduled. That is, we're all going to just show up. It'll be the last session of the program. And I want you to start thinking about, for that last session, of things that you may want us to talk about in the last session. So this will be the 1:15 session next Saturday. What I like to do is a little bit of just kind of summarizing what we've done this seminar, thinking about what we might do in the future, thinking about the needs in the field. If any particular faculty member in particular who's been with us wants to kind of draw out something a little bit more, talk a little bit more about more of something that they're doing, that's the time to do it. I never like to schedule anything in that last session, maybe do a little bit of oral evaluation and so forth. So that's what's going on. And then the last slide, just to remind you all, we are recording, we'll archive, and we've archived. Last weekend's already been archived on our YouTube channel. I'm going to create a live transcription. I'll start that in a minute. Please go ahead if you haven't already. I know I ask you to do this every time, but there are always different people in the room for various reasons. So introduce yourself in the chat: name, college, organization, location, contact information, interests. Keep your camera on if you can. It's not required, but it's helpful to presenters. Mute yourself unless you're speaking. You should use your name tag, make sure your name is reflective, and consider using your pronouns, or at least putting your pronouns in there. And then if you've got questions, contact Priscilla. We go for 15 minutes, then 15 minutes of Q&A, and then hand raise when we're doing Q&A. I'm going to go ahead and end that show and start admitting people, because people are showing up, which is just wonderful. And then I am also going to, all right. Hit live transcription also. So that's been enabled. So I see a few just joined us. Elizabeth joined us. Sharon's joined us. Ty, Susan, Phil is with us. Susan and Ty, Phil and Susan are going to be presenting. John, Jillian, Will, Tulin. We've got a few minutes before we start. It's like almost 10 after, so we'll start at 12:15. But does anybody want to share any thoughts from yesterday? Like I said, I missed the sessions yesterday. Any observations about the program at this point? Anything they want to comment or ask about? You can just go ahead and open your mic because we're a small group this morning.
Good morning, David. Hi,
Good morning,
David.
Susan. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Good, good, good.
Great. I think Ash will be along shortly. Just want to be sure he has the Zoom link. But I
Okay.
wanted to say I did enjoy the session yesterday. I was there briefly for Michael Collins' session, and I really appreciated hearing about the Economics Institute and the Global Peace Index again. I do use that in class, but I only touch on it. So he did a really great interactive activity with us. He had us think about, the different factors of what influences a violent versus nonviolent country or area, and all the different factors that contribute to that. And then he asked us to think about our own locality, our own town or city. And I thought that was really valuable.
Yeah. It's always good to kind of put it in the context of where you live. Sometimes this is all kind of a theoretical conversation, but if you can think about your neighbors, your own environment and so forth, that's really helpful. Anybody else have any observations from yesterday?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just hi everyone. I'll
Hey, Ty.
Riff off of what Susan was saying. Just I've used the Global Peace Index in classes for nearly a decade now, but I really appreciated the activity that he walked us through of making it real for our own contexts, and just made some notes and planning next time I teach a course where we look at that, of doing a very similar activity with the students. I think sometimes it's it's almost hard to make sense of for people, unless they can relate it to their own experience. And I think what he shared and walked us through will help students be able to relate to and understand the information and data better. So
great, thanks. Anybody else? Any other thoughts or observations from yesterday or the weekend before that? All right. Let's see. I'm going to let Ash in. Ash is joining us. Thank you. So we've got another minute or two, so I want Ash to get in. And Susan, Phil, and Ash, you're all ready, right? I imagine to go.
Sure are. Yep.
Okay. Is Ash a student at Adelphi or Nashua?
He's at Adelphi. He's an undergrad at Adelphi.
Okay.
Hey, Ash.
All right,
welcome.
Ash. Nice to see you. Okay. So go ahead, John. You want to say something?
Oh, if it's okay. I wanted to know about all the videos that you're uploading. Will they be in perpetually being able to access in the future?
Last weekend is already in our YouTube channel. So I
Right.
think Priscilla sent everybody a link. It's there.
Right.
We have a lot of stuff on our YouTube channel going back a little ways.
Right.
So, as long as YouTube is there, it'll be there, right?
Okay.
Now, if Elon Musk buys YouTube, I'm not so sure. So we'll just have to see what happens on that end, right? So
Yeah.
just as an aside, I probably told you my niece, I don't know if I told you, my niece works for Apple in San Francisco. One of her roommates works for Twitter. Well, it doesn't work for Twitter anymore. She was let go, and she got one of those emails yesterday. So
Jeez.
a lot of craziness going on with Twitter. I know a lot of people are kind of following it, and I'm going to see my niece at Thanksgiving, so I'll get a sense of how her roommate is doing. So yeah, don't know, right? Those of you in California are probably following it more than we are. I don't know, John, following all the tech stuff, right?
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah. Spreading hate.
Yeah. I mean, apparently that's what Elon Musk is going to do, is take down all the restrictions and kind of just open it up, right? Kind of a thing, right?
Well,
Make it kind of a Wild West.
I don't know if that will come back to haunt him because they need all the advertising. I've seen
Right.
some advertising already distancing themselves from it because they can see what's coming on here. So that may backfire on him. I don't know, but I
Right.
hope so.
Right. No, that's the issue all the time, right? Is that what you think is in the best interest, the advertisers don't think it's in their interest. They don't want to be associated with you for that reason.
Well, look
And
at
not,
All right.
and not to mention the fact that he's blaming his lack of revenue and his cutoffs of half of his workforce. He's blaming it on activists.
Right. He's saying that's the reason, right? All right, so why don't we go ahead and start? I'm going to just do a little brief introduction of Susan, Phil, and Ash, and then I'll turn it over for them. They have 45 minutes, and then there's another 15 minutes if we want to do Q&A, if people have questions. And that additional 15 minutes, which will go from 1 to 1:15 Eastern time. People want to get up and walk around, that's fine. If we want more questions, that's fine. Then at 1:15, we'll go to the next session. So, you know, Susan for a long time. I'm glad that she's here. Susan Cushman has been a professor of English and Women and Gender Studies at Nassau Community College, SUNY, since 2003. Susan also teaches introductory rights courses in human rights and peace studies using both a social science and humanities lens. She chairs civic engagement for Nassau Community College, and as a member of the League of Women Voters has received grants to bring election and voter information to campuses and to underserved population. She also teaches as an adjunct. I guess you're teaching peace studies at Adelphi University, and a lot of this has to do with her connection to Adelphi today. Phil, also I've known for a while, and I'm glad that he's here, has over 20 years of leadership, programming, and analysis experience in the areas of peace, education, youth, and community development, and psychotherapy. He's lived, worked, and traveled in 50 countries across 6 continents, taught in schools, colleges, universities around the world, and trained thousands on peace and social change issues. Phil's received multiple awards for his work, including the Rotary Peace Fellowship and the Catherine Davis Fellowship for Peace. He also has a Positive Peace Activator and Global Peace Index Ambassador for the Institute for Economics and Peace, which presented yesterday. Ash, I'm just meeting you. I can't say much about you, but I hope you will introduce yourself. I know you're a student at Adelphi University. Probably I'll leave it to Susan to introduce you and what you're doing. So we would love to hear about the great things that you're doing also. So I'm going to turn it over to the 3 of you now. I'll ask everybody to turn off their mics unless they're asking a question. Susan, Phil, and Ash, you should be able to share your screens, and it's in your trusty hands.
Thank you so much, David. It's great to be here. And I'm more than happy to introduce Ash and say a little bit more about Phil. So Ash was an undergraduate student of mine at Adelphi University last fall of 21. He was a standout student who really took the lead on the group project that we're going to tell you about and share today. So it's been a delight to work with Ash. He's an undergraduate psychology major at Adelphi. And for those of you who don't know, Adelphi is a private university in Garden City, New York on Long Island. And Ash has been incredibly helpful to our project, as you'll soon see. He is a psych major, and he's thinking about minoring in peace studies and I believe Africana or Black and Caribbean studies. Yeah, cool.
Update a little on that actually. From when I last emailed, I actually did add the peace studies minor onto it.
Woohoo! Awesome.
A lot of process. I think
Awesome.
3 people, but it went through, so that can be updated now.
Beautiful, beautiful. So it's exciting because I really have only had the opportunity so far at Adelphi to do the Gen Ed courses, which has been great though, because as you'll soon see, it gives students kind of who are first year students at the university an introduction to an interdisciplinary field of peace studies, and they can go in different directions with it, right? They can go in peace and conflict resolution, they can go in more of a humanities direction or a social work direction. So I'm excited that Ash connected with the field and has declared it as a minor. And what can I say about Phil? Phil and I, honestly, I can't recall exactly where we met, but he has been fantastic to work with. We probably met somewhere along the line through World Beyond Wars, all their great webinars, which I'll let him tell you about. But Phil and I have been working together now for a few years. I'm always looking for professional development opportunities. And so I did a course, I think, with World Beyond War. And that gave me the opportunity to meet Phil, who's the education director there. And, you know, when I started at Adelphi and they were encouraging us to do innovative work, innovative teaching, I thought, hey, I think I'll contact Phil Gittens and see if he'd like to innovate with me on something. So I'm going to share the screen and show you our PowerPoint and go from there. But I just want to say before starting officially that David Smith, too, has been immensely supportive of my work. You know, he's had me present at his seminar before. I've learned a tremendous amount from him. And his books, both on peace building at the community college level and Peace Jobs, his more recent book, which really helps students think about peace studies, not just as a course or even a minor, but as a career. And so I've been able to introduce career building into the class thanks to David's work. So I just definitely wanted to mention that. So, okay, I'm going to share this PowerPoint. I hope you all can see it. The title of it is When Academics and Nonprofits Collaborate, Innovative Peace Building Beyond the Classroom. Because the more I teach this in this field, and I really love teaching in this field, as David said, I teach many things, but English is my first love, I always say. Literature is my first love. Peace studies is my new love. I just love it and teach it every chance I get as either an elective at Nassau, or which I created the course for Nassau, or as a gen ed course at Adelphi. So try to redefine it kind of a little bit each time I do it to see what's new and what's happening out there. And the more I've worked with Phil, the more I realize that and I know Phil's going to talk about this, that it's important to help students bridge theory and practice. So there's some meaning to it. So it's not just a bunch of theories in a vacuum or a bottle, but no, these are opportunities for me to create something for the world and make it better and less violent and more peaceful. So that's kind of our shtick. And you know, I believe that this connects with David's annual seminar because he's all about redefining himself and innovating, if you don't mind my saying that, David. And I was looking at your kind of broad description of the seminar, and I really think that, you know, showcasing approaches to peace building, whether it's pedagogical or practical, you know, the fact that your hope is to spur innovative thinking and solutions, I thought, wow, this really is a good venue in which to share our innovative live class. And I use that phrase because that's Adelphi's word. Adelphi University is very big on they have an innovation center. And I'll be curious to hear if other people here have such a center at their college or university. I know that Nassau doesn't, and I'd like to see Nassau consider such an entity because this innovation center serves a sole purpose for the institution. It is there to help instructors pair their classes, whatever the class is, whether it's peace studies or business 101, with either a business model, like a business, a company, a for-profit institution, or a nonprofit institution like World Beyond War. So naturally, when I heard about this innovation center, I was very excited to try my peace studies course within this model, you know, and that's hence the title of our presentation and what we did last semester and we're continuing to do. And one thing we've learned is that innovation is not always neat and tidy. It can be messy, but we've also learned that it's so rewarding in the way that it's stretching our professional growth and change. And I think this is the key right here. I should have highlighted it on the PowerPoint, if you can see it with all this verbiage. Within this model, faculty stretch their repertoire by interfacing with peace organizations. Students, like Ash, learn how to approach industry partners and create projects for them in the form of deliverables. And nonprofits, like World Beyond War in this case, increase their visibility, reach, and impact by sharing their peace-building goals with faculty and students. So it's a win-win-win model. And I'm just going to say one more little bit about the course, and then Phil's going to take it from there, and then certainly Ash is going to follow up with his work in the course. So my Intro to Peace Studies course, has a good balance of humanities and social science. Like I said, I have worked with the Economics Institute material before in the Global Peace Index, but I've also looked at literature and film and even kind of the origins of religious peace building, or peace building interfaith across religions. And that includes secular humanism. So it's not like a real didactic, approach, but it's more or less looking at, some of the religious origins of some of the greatest peacemakers of all time, like Gandhi and Dr. King and Dorothy Day, and so on. So my course is pretty balanced in that way. I look at case studies, leaders and movements, peace organizations, and then, as I said before, careers in peace building. And I have to credit, David Smith for introducing me to that whole, notion of introducing that to students in an intro level course. The Innovation Center is, like I said, this entity at Adelphi University that pairs faculty who are interested in the model with businesses or nonprofits. And when I asked, can I choose my own nonprofit? Do you make that choice for me, or can I make it? They said, well, provide us with a list. It was very interesting, actually. Provide us with a list of organizations that are interesting to you, and we'll tell you which ones we think would be a good fit. And so, World Beyond War was like on my top 3, and they must have researched it and they loved it. And so here we are today. From there, the Innovation Center kind of provided a space with like cutting edge technology beyond my comprehension, quite frankly, where we could meet, and students could use like the Jamboard, and they could try to figure out what topics they were interested in for their projects. And they would sort of beam, Dr. Phil right into our class to kind of watch what was going on and comment on what was going on. So the Innovation Center was a really important third actor in this that, I think is a great model for all institutions in an ideal world. I realized that, at public colleges like Nassau, where I teach, there might not be the funding for it. But that's kind of my goal as I move toward the end of my career, is to think about how can I make a pitch for this? How can we, seek public funding for such innovation centers where really unique collaborations can take place? And like I said, win-win-win, right? For the institution, for the organization, and most of all for the students. So finally, through a series of virtual visits with World Beyond War's director, Phil Gittins, students devised final projects in local contexts that aligned with World Beyond War's mission of peace education and nonviolent conflict resolution. They produced educational materials for World Beyond War. Oh, I'm sorry, I keep going up to Phil's slides. Sorry, Phil. They provided recorded presentations, webinars, and curriculum lessons. So we're going to share a little bit of that with you today. And Ash in particular will share his contribution to his group project. So I'm going to turn it over to Phil right now, who is going to say a bit about his organizational hopes and dreams for this project. Go ahead, Phil.
Thank you so much. And hello, everyone. Yes, I'm going to talk a little bit about the win-win-win that Susan was talking about. But just before that, I always love to get a sense of who's here. So let's just do something, because we're all on camera. Let's get a sense of who's here. And I'll ask a question, and if the answer is yes, maybe you can wave or put your thumb up or do a reaction, etc., just to get a sense of who's here. So reaction, you could do something like this, or something like this, or you could take yourself off mute and shout yes. Okay, just to get a sense of who's here. Okay, so if you are someone teaching peace, conflict, social change issues, broadly speaking, in schools, put your hand up. In schools. Okay, in schools. Okay, great. If maybe with the English hat on here, I mean high schools, so secondary schools, etc. If you're someone who's teaching peace building, conflict resolution, social change issues broadly related in universities? Put your hand up or wave, etc. Okay, perfect. And maybe if you're an academic, put your hands up. You're doing research around these issues. Okay. And put your hands up if you think that more can be done in the world to engage young people and people of all ages in learning about peace and peace building. Okay, super. So I think that everybody put their hand up then. So what we see here is that it's this idea of unity and diversity. So we've got diverse people from diverse locations, etc. here, but we're all kind of coalescing around this goal that much more can be done to engage all people. As Galton would say, you know, we all have a role to play in peace building. So thank you for that. I just wanted to get a sense. Susan, I don't know if you can put the screen on large screen because it's kind of on a smaller screen now.
Sure. Let me work on that.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I mean, we can see, you know, and while you're doing that, what I'll do just before speaking about kind of the broader ideas underpinning the model that Susan, Adelphi, others, etc., and World Beyond War worked on. It might be worth saying a little bit about World Beyond War very, very briefly. So World Beyond War is a global grassroots organization. We started in 2014. We now have membership in 193 countries. We can only do the great work that we do because of the great people that we work with in all these different countries. We try and differentiate ourselves from other peace building organizations in two ways. One, global in scope, and two, against the war system. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about this. So not just war in Afghanistan, war in South Sudan, against the institution of war. So this is the things that happen before, during, and after. So before is the ongoing preparation for war, which often takes place in global north countries, although the immediacy of war often takes place, although not always, in global south countries. So this is before. The during is where the bombs are dropped, when the physical war happens, but then the remnants of war. So what happens after the war finishes, which has an ongoing legacy. And take a look around the world, we can see the ongoing legacies of war today. So we're against the institution of war, you know, in the sense that 2 trillion is spent on preparing for war around the world. The UN suggests that maybe about 30 billion is needed to end global starvation on the planet. About 3% of military spending can end global starvation on the planet. So that just gives you a little bit about World Beyond War. We work in two areas. One, education. We have online courses. Well done. Good stuff, Susan. Well done. We have online courses, fact sheets, podcasts. Our seminal book is called A Global Security System, an Alternative to War, which frames a lot of our work. Of course, education is necessary, but it's not sufficient. So we also need action as well. In fact, both need to work together, education and action. I'm going to be saying something about that shortly. On the action side of things, World Beyond War, we have a number of different campaigns and strategies, but two in particular. One is divestment. So how do we go about divesting money away from the war machine, $2 trillion each year, towards more productive activities, which are needed always, but particularly right now in terms of the economic crisis, in terms of COVID. So how do we divest that money away to more productive activities such as education, health, etc. And then the other one is closing foreign military bases, which we see as propping up the war system. So how do we go about working with communities to get these foreign military bases out of the particular context where they are? We won the 2021 US Peace Prize for our creative approaches to peace education and global challenges. And just before that, we won, in collaboration with the Global Campaign for Peace Education, the Global Educators Challenge Award, again, for our very creative approaches to peace education. So with regards to the wonderful collaboration with Adelphi, and Susan deserves all of the credit for her leadership for bringing this about. There was a few kind of broader ideas underpinning this model, and it's also being used to inform another project, which I was just saying to David earlier. I've just been in Switzerland speaking about another project which actually involved a similar model to what I'm going to share now, but in 12 different countries. It was a lot of work. So we looked around at peace studies and peace education, and broadly speaking, that there's a lot of tension, challenges, opportunities, and binaries with regards to theory, practice, education, action, youth, adults, global north, global south, etc., etc. And we wanted to try and address them. And here is something I put together here to try and flesh out some of the broader ideas underpinning the work that informed the model. One is this idea, and Susan spoke about it, about the linking of theory and practice. We really love Anthony Bing's idea of we should be really trying to support students to engage in processes, thinking their way into new forms of action and acting their way into new forms of thinking. Of course, there is the justification of the interlinkages between theory and practice, education and action. The second one here is hopefully an opportunity to try and link education and action. So learning about peace, the theories, concepts, ideas, etc., which are necessary but not sufficient, but then supporting students to practice the practice of peace building. This happens in a field which we all too often know is there's a gap between the thinkers and the doers, the theorists and the practitioners. David, you'll recognize this one because you were involved with this great research along with Craig and others. There's a gap between what universities are providing, what young people want, what students want, and what employers want. On one hand, universities are very good at theory and concepts and expertise, which is necessary, again, but not sufficient. On the other hand, what students, employers are looking for is things like project management experience, transferable skills that can be used within, but also beyond the peace building field. Fourth one, youth agency. Too frequently, peace work is done to young people or done about them in terms of both research, policy, and programming. They're often the recipients or being acted upon or being researched on. What we wanted to do was, how can we try and work with young people to support them, to do projects with them, and the young people actually do the projects. So again, they get this practice of practicing project management, practicing the practice of peace building. Can you go to the next slide, please, Susan?
There you go.
Perfect. Another interesting thing is that, and this kind of challenges the way in which most universities are set up. In fact, actually, you guys in the US are very good at this in terms of liberal colleges and things. But generally speaking, many universities around the world are set up. We're going to study psychology 9 till 10, sociology 10 till 11. The world does not work like that. If we want to address, study, improve issues related to violence and peace, we cannot study it through one lens. You know, I'm a psychotherapist by trade, but I did my doctorate in international conflict analysis, and that was strategic in the sense that we have to understand interpersonal relationships, how we get on with each other, but we also need to understand the structures as well. So one thing that was great about this model is that it brought students together from different disciplines so that they could learn with and from each other. Another great learning opportunity. The next one here, a focus on pro-peace and anti-war efforts. And I think this is particularly relevant. There's a lot of amazing work done around the world with regards to positive peace. Thank you to IEP. And we also need to remember that positive peace has a longer history. It goes back to Galton and actually even before Galton, but although Galton coined the term. At its core, positive peace includes how do we stop future generations, as the UN might say, from engaging in war? How do we put in place the conditions, the structures, etc., to stop people from waging violence, going to war, etc.? Now, on one hand, there's some great work with regards to pro-peace activities, but I think we need to get much better at stopping the violence in the first place. As you would have learned through IEP, 16 trillion is spent a year on trying to contain the economic cost of violence. Other research that I've saw suggests that about 10 trillion of that can be attributed to wars, etc. If you take a look at many of the people who were speaking on this great gathering here and last week, etc. The refugee crisis. War is the leading cause of homelessness and the refugee crisis. Over 100 million people right now. That goes back to war. War is one of the leading causes of death, injury around the world. War is at the core of the two existential crises that we now face. The link with nuclear weapons is very clear, so I don't need to talk about that. But the link with the climate change is not as clear. Not as many people know about this. The leading polluter on the planet and the leading user of fossil fuels on the planet is the military. So if we want to make progress on the two existential threats that we're facing, we need to have a look at the issue of war. So, but that's not to say, because people think, oh, so you're just, why do you, with World Beyond War, and it says it in the name, people think, oh, you're just against war. No, we're 100% for peace. We just recognize that in order to get a sustainable and lasting peace, we have to address the current system that we have right now. And the current system that we have right now is undoubtedly, evidence shows, the war system. So what we did on this program, thanks to Professor Cushman, is that we introduced students to both pro-peace and anti-war activities, looking at the downsides of war, but very, 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 very importantly, how do we replace the current war system with a peace system where peace, drawing on Galton, can be pursued by peaceful means? So this was the idea. And then the third thing was we were very strategic and thoughtful about producing products of use. What I mean by that is, as Professor Cushman said, a win-win-win. Win-win-win-win. So a win for Adelphi in terms of innovating around new kind of approaches, innovating around engaging students more effectively in the mix between theory and practice. A win, most importantly for the young people, in the sense that they had opportunities to mix the theory and practice. They had chances to engage and practice the practice of peace building through developing transferable skills, which are needed outside of the peace building field and within. Teamwork, communication, conflict in terms of working through, well, what project are we going to do, etc. These are all things that what tends to happen is that you'll go to university, you'll study these things, then you get out in the big world, and then you try and practice these things. Well, young people need opportunities to practice them, I think, while learning as well. Learning by doing, going back to John Dewey, is one of the best ways of learning. But learning by doing is not the only important thing. Another important thing, again, from John Dewey and others, talks about the importance of reflection. So it's one thing to learn by doing, it's one thing to learn by learning, but real significant learning takes place through reflection. So we built in kind of ongoing reflections in terms of what was covered with Professor Cushman in the classes, but also, as Professor Cushman said, I would beam in and listen and reflect on some of the things going on. Also a win for World Beyond War. We're interested in working with innovative universities and colleges, and please, if people are interested in working together, we would love to collaborate with you in terms of how can we support universities and colleges to better engage students in peace and conflict issues, but vice versa, how can colleges support us to kind of spread the word and widen our sphere of influence? So we were interested in some of the products, and we're going to be talking about them shortly, that young people put together through their projects. We could use them as deliverables to put on our platform to showcase the great work of the young people. This was something very, very interesting for us. And again, this is kind of a first of its kind. And again, I'm being serious now. Thank you to Professor Cushman for her leadership and innovation. We wanted to use this as a model to show how is it possible to work with students, take them through a journey of learning about peace building and peace education theories, concepts, but also within one semester, support them to do projects as well, so that they can actually see the tangible outcomes of their work. So this was another kind of win-win-win for all three. And then finally, another thing about the model is that leveraging something which young people are looking towards more and more these days. They want to learn technology, social media skills, etc. So we leveraged the use of digital technology to bring us together. So I'm now here in Bolivia, speaking to you all. What a wonderful way to kind of get to know you all, and we're doing this through leveraging digital technology. So hopefully that's give a little bit of an idea about the broader ideas and practices underpinning this model. And as we move forward, Professor Cushman and Ash, you can maybe keep some of these ideas in mind and think how we really try to walk the talk of doing this in practice, not just talk the talk. So thank you so much. And I think I'll pass it on to my next colleague. Thank you.
Right on. Thank you, Phil. Yeah. And, we're all learning at like I said, the bit of the messy part of it. We're here to give you like the overview, but and all the pros that we got from this project. And we're going to talk about some of the cons and some of the conflicts that we've been pushing through and working through. And we're going to close later with some revisions that we've made this semester. But it's all good, as the saying goes. So, okay. So thanks again, Phil, for all that you've brought to light, both all the studies and the World Beyond War kind of organizational goals. Honestly, those 3 goals that are mapped out in the World Beyond War alternative global system, security system book. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. It's going to be on my last slide, the text themselves that they've used for some of their classes, and which kind of underlines their work as an organization. There were 3 areas that I introduced to the class from that World Beyond War model. These are the kinds of peace building students might be interested in. Demilitarizing security, nonviolent conflict resolution, or peace education. And you might not be surprised to learn that most of them gravitated toward the second 2, and perhaps most popularly, peace education, right? A positive peace approach, because the negative peace approach of wanting to stop violence and work on ceasefires and shut down military bases, that is a little bit more advanced. That may be something more appealing to an upper class man or woman, right? But honestly, the students this semester are stepping out a little bit more closer to those goals. Of taking on the demilitarizing security. But I was very kind of gentle in my approach with this because it was our first time doing it. And I said, hey, look, if every group is going to do some variation on peace education, that's what I do for a living. I'm a peace educator in addition to other subjects, but I was all for it. So the 4 groups that emerged after we had our first month of sort of a foundation to peace education, after meeting Dr. Gittens, the students, met at the Innovation Center. We used the Jamboard, this collaborative digital whiteboard, where we put on the board the 3 areas of demilitarized security, nonviolent conflict resolution, and peace education. And the students literally kind of walked around and thought about which area was of interest to them. And they put little yellow stickies on the board with their name on it next to what they were interested in. And that's essentially how we formed groups. Yeah, there was a little bit of switching around and equal distribution, but that worked out pretty well. In early October last year, we met, from there, we basically formed our groups, and these were the groups that emerged. Elementary school peacemakers, of which Ash was a part, high school peace studies curriculum, interreligious peace builders, and student organizers for nonviolent resistance. And I'm going to turn it over to my student Ash right now, who is going to we're going to give you the overview of all 4 groups, and then Ash will have the rest of the time to talk about his exact contribution to that group. So take it away, Ash. Tell them about your group project.
This overview stated earlier, my group was the one who focused on elementary school peacemakers. Specifically, my group was 4th grade. My group researched the New York State, we referenced the New York State Elementary School 4th grade social studies curriculum and pulled 5 famous peacemakers from different contexts, from Native American culture, abolitionist history, women's rights advocates, and immigration advocates, making peacemaking connection between these leaders. We spoke of nonviolent resistance of Daganoweda, Claire Limich, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Jane Addams, and Alice Paul. With colorful age-appropriate charts and images, the peacemaker theme was prominent in our proposed enhanced 4th grade social studies curriculum. We introduced the Great Peacemakers website featuring paintings, prose, and videos of historic luminaries by artist Steve Simon. My group also proposed a game in which a game or a way to memorize this called a game that one of my group members, we was Samantha, called Mumball, in which students can practice their knowledge of peacemakers through quick rounds of questioning and answering while passing the ball between them back and forth.
Yeah, cool. And he'll say a lot more about this group. You're going to get like much more detail on this group. This is coming out of a report that Phil and I wrote up together, and that's hence the third person slash, first person, so that it's Ash can plug in from his first person perspective. But we'll say a bit about the other groups, and then I'm totally turning it over to you, Ash. Okay. The high school group focused their project on the development of peace education at the high school level. They were very innovative and creative. They said, all right, how are we going to do this? The students are less likely, I think, to, well, let me take it back, because Ash, your group really did research fourth grade curriculum, New York State curriculum. So I have to hand it to you. This group wasn't crazy about doing that angle of research. Like, what are the high schools working on now? One student said, I'm just going to contact my alma mater. I'm going to go back to Carl Place High School in Westbury, New York, and contact my history teacher and see if she can give us a hand, like see if she would allow us to present to her classroom. And I allowed that. I allowed that to happen. I thought it was great. I said, sure. I met the teacher. The teacher said, sure, they can come into the classroom virtually and talk about peacemaking. We can't record it. And I said, that's fine. So what the students did kind of brilliantly was they did like a trial run where they virtually went into this history class, and they presented on a few topics like peace journalism and shows like Democracy Now!, which show a very different viewpoint than some of your other media out there. They talked a little bit about women's suffrage, because we had learned that in the class as an area of peacemaking. And they were interested in civic engagement, which I know is another theme of this seminar. So the high school teacher and class were really very receptive. And we all agreed that the next step after this would be to propose such a unit to a review board at Carl Place High School and maybe other Long Island high schools. So it was really exciting. And I have to say that group did a great job recreating their video. They recreated the experience of going into that class and then showed it to our class and to World Beyond War. Interreligious peacebuilding. Phil, you feel like reading that one? Feel free.
Oh, yes. Yeah, this team developed a project aimed at facilitating dialogue between different religions while promoting education around the role of religion in peace building. They did so in two ways. First, by participating in a campus event, Our Sacred Relationship with the Environment, organized by Adelphi University Interfaith Center on the, I'm thinking in English here, on the 18th of November, 2021, which brought 25 campus members together from Christian, Jewish, and Muslim faith backgrounds to discuss religion, spirituality, and the environment. The team gave a presentation titled Bringing Indigenous Wisdom to the Interfaith Center, focusing on the peace-building initiatives of Indigenous peoples. Second, they created a website with interviews between team members and AU religious clubs. I can't, there's something in the way there, so I can't read.
I know, I can't get that black box out. I'm sorry.
And they explored misconceptions about religions and to emphasize commonalities and peace building strategies in each group. I think it says,
there's a black box I can't get rid of. Sorry, guys. So this was thanks, Phil. And it's kind of ironic that we thought we would just break up reading these groups, and Phil right now is very much involved with helping this semester's group that is interested in interreligious peace building. This time, they're going to an organization called CICID, with which Phil is very much affiliated. He's a CICID fellow. So it's just it's kind of ironic that that's the one that you're reading, because we literally this morning before this program, we're trying to help one of my current students get through to Phil's colleague at CICID to do some interreligious peace building research and talk about CICID and their work. All right, next up I'll read, is the last group, and I'll be very quick because I want Ash to have some time. The last group contacted Peace Action New York State, which is the oldest grassroots peace organization in the country, honestly. They work on no nukes initiatives primarily, but they also have quite an educational wing into their organization now. In New York alone, there are 18 chapters at different SUNY schools, CUNY schools, and I would love to see one at Adelphi and maybe Nassau at some point in the future. I've worked very closely with Emily Rubino, who's the director of this organization for the couple of years. I support it personally, financially, because I really believe in the work that they do. And it was great that the students had an opportunity to meet with other students who are a little farther along with peace building at their colleges, right? They have these PANIS chapters, and maybe one day they'll have World Beyond War chapters. And this is another win-win that Phil and I keep kind of adding to the base of benefits here. Phil has now been in touch with Peace Action New York State, right? And so they're working on collaborating and supporting one another. So these students interviewed some staff members at Peace Action New York State, and they met other students about the kind of work they're doing at their campuses. All right, Ash, you've been so patient. Before we get to the conclusion, Ash is going to share with you the screen. David, does Ash have access to show his little presentation on what he did for his group? I don't know how I can. Do I have to stop the share to make that happen?
Let me
No, you
try.
don't have to, but Ash, we can multiple share. So Ash can share his stuff.
Okay.
So is it on the screen?
Yep. Great.
So as a Frederick Cushman, or I guess I also stated earlier, my group focused on elementary school, specifically 4th grade. This is a modified version of what we initially did. One of our main focuses was to introduce peacemakers to the curriculum without having to diverge or like make an alternate curriculum for the 4th grade curriculum, which is why we initially tried to cite and refer to the curriculum of the 4th grade directly. We're not trying to replace, we're trying to adapt and support. I will be using 2 examples that from the peacemaker that we referenced. One of them was one of the group makers, one of my group members did on Deganawida with the Native American unit. Then I did Harriet Tubman for abolitionism. This is one of the reference guides that we use, which could be changed. One of my group members used Deganawida as an example. Unless it changed from when I've last edited this presentation, Deganawida himself is not referenced directly in the curriculum as a person of reference, which is why, and also because my group learned about him back when I was in that Peace Studies class. So we refer to him as an example of it. He would be an example of us introducing a person to the curriculum to introduce a peacemaker. Later on, you'll see my slides. Harriet Tubman is cited and she is referenced in the curriculum itself, but it's mainly about her actions through the Underground Railroad, which is important. But if Deganawida referencing him is a introduce of a concept of a person, Harriet Tubman, with how I did it, I want to introduce a concept of action through her Underground Railroad. But let's focus for right now on Deganawida. My friend or my group mainly let's focus on his actions as the great maker of peace, specifically more about how he unionized the 6 tribes of the Iroquois. You may not be familiar to many people in this Zoom call, but there are depictions or legends or mythos of him like cleaning out or combing out the hair of another Iroquois member, like combing out the snakes out of his hair to try and show that he's trying to unionize all the Iroquois or all the 6 tribes of Iroquois into one group of peace or one aspect of peace and uniting all of them, which I believe, yeah, this is an example of what we did here, or my group here, which we cited directly what he did, how he's important. and why we would even reference him, to try and show that he's an example of a peacemaker through the lens of Native American unit that the schools would already do. It's not, we are not trying to like add another unit in which could complicate things for the schools or the teachers directly. Another aspect which I think could be important. Initially here, this is where I had the image of him coming out the hair, coming the snakes out of the person's hair. But Professor Cushman and we went back and forth saying how the depiction of the image may be too on the word risque, because that seems a bit like out of a wrong word here, but it may be too like graphically shown for fourth graders. So instead of, well, that's an important aspect which could be added on or it's shown in another method or shown in another depiction. Another aspect which I think could be important to show or explain would be simply how like not specifically the Ganawida himself, but rather the Iroquois tribe, like as a whole, how it impacted America specifically. For instance, his unionization of the tribe of the Iroquois would eventually inspire America to try and mimic it with our current three-part system of the judicial branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. Oh, wow, hold on, that's bad. It should be judicial, executive, and legislative on how judicial got posted. I apologize about that. Another aspect in which you took from the Iroquois was, that we as Americans, as Americans, we might not be American in the Zoom call, that Americans took aspect up from the Iroquois was how it eventually inspired and helped the act of women's rights, which another group member I did a person, I believe that was Paul. While the referencing the acting the peacemaker of the Ganawida is important, it may also be helpful for students or even like teachers trying to segue into other units that, okay, like the Ganawida was a Native American and he promoted peace and he did acts of peace. But furthermore, that his actions not only impacted the Iroquois themselves, but rather his actions and the Iroquois tribesmen as a whole impacted other aspects of American culture, another aspect of the world. So that was my group members' depiction of the Ganawida and my added on aspect of how it impacted American culture. And we'll keep scrolling through. This was another group member. This is my aspect of the slide, which I want to focus on Harriet Tubman, specifically her act as an abolitionist and her innovation of the Underground Railroad throughout America to connect and introduce the concept of negative peace, to which here I describe the aspect of negative peace. Now, for those who may not be informed, while the phrase negative peace may sound very counterintuitive, negative with bad and peace, we also want to promote peace. So how could bad peace be a thing? Negative peace as a term does not mean like evil peace or like bad peace. It's the act. It's other examples could be promoting ceasefires. Example outside of this context would be think of like sit-ins during Martin Luther King Jr.'s time to try and advocate for the equal rights of people of color, particularly people of color, or like salt marshes from Gandhi's time. It's ways of trying to show peace or show acts of peace or promote peace through ways that may be deemed as, in what in his book say coercive means, which also may sound a bit counterintuitive, but coercive in this case is not meaning evil. It's just meaning ways to try and show peace or inspire or show ways of, or introducing peace through ways that may go against, for example, like unjust laws or unjust practices. In this case, I'm using negative peace with Harriet Tubman's Underground Railroad, and so that, in case it might also be known, Underground Railroad was a system in which it was a way to try and liberate slaves from the South to try and bring them to the North, which would let them be in a safer condition rather than being in the South in slave camps and plantations. So I would say in my group, or my aspect of the group, I was going to aim to focus on her aspects or negative peace, or view her aspect of Underground Railroad through a lens of negative peace. You can also make an argument that it could be positive peace, as while it is or both positive and negative peace, because while it is going against an unjust law or practice, the Underground Railroad did help the abolitionist movement be more known. Well, known in the sense of like it helped introduce others to the concept of abolitionism and going against or promoting like anti-slavery laws or practices. And furthermore, here's the image from that website that we mentioned earlier. Just to also to show that just how impactful the Underground Railroad was, with her being a main aspect of it, of course, but just as a concept, the Underground Railroad as a system to liberate people, or specifically slaves in this case, from these unjust practices or laws. Now, with these aspects in mind, I would love to say that the research behind it all was very much a process. I just cite like textbooks and find websites that depict images. So other people as well have to go through like valleys of websites and everything. But despite all that, I would say that the experience was overly positive. It was a lot about teamwork and collaboration, and a lot about like just trying to like how can we depict these either concept, in my case as an example, like concept as a negative piece, or introducing people like one of my group members did with the Ganawida to a 4th grade audience. And in that same vein, a difficulty of ours was how do we, or twofold. One, the people that we do cite or reference, which in this case, the Ganawida, for example, we learned about it, we meaning my group and my class, we learned about him through the course, so we referenced him. But one could say that, oh, like the people that we reference may be, well, Harriet Tubman is used directly in the curriculum, so that's not a good example. But if we cited a person that may be like maybe unknown, or may not be like well enough known, or maybe the person's like slightly, let's use the word controversial in air quotes here, it may be bad to try and reference them as a I'm using the word vessel here loosely because they're people, but it may be bad or not good to reference them as a vessel for like a peacemaking effort, or just as a person to reference. Another difficulty was trying to, like as Crippen stated earlier, one of the group members also did peace through education, and they went to their high school. I tried to reference my 4th grade teacher in that school. Another group member also did a similar thing, and they never got back to us, which was it wouldn't say it was like harming or like it was a dissuading type of situation, but it was just like, wow, I thought it would be easier than what it was. But we still, meaning my group and Professor Cushman and even Phil, we pushed through and try to send it out in a way that, well, my group in a way that sent it out to where it presentable to a school. This is modified somewhat from the original process. Another aspect that I could say would be maybe an improvement upon my group, or even like other groups that may want to do a similar process, would be like my group, we did a PowerPoint presentation, but other groups did videos or even recorded Zoom calls. I believe it was the religious peacemaking group, for example, when they interviewed all the the information center at the school, they made a website which Professor Cushman tried to access, and I tried to send a way to maybe try and access it still. But I think on both of our ends it's difficult. It's difficult on both of our ends to try and get that website back up or try and cite it in some way. But it just there's other methods of trying to like try and promote or like even teach others about, like obviously in the case it's peace education, but through other means other than just presentations and videos, or presentations or websites. There's other more free-form ways. Like my group, for example, we didn't have to do a presentation. We could have done like a video broadcast or like a podcast or like another method. Our group aimed, it was one, ease of access for my group and Phil's organization and other people, but also through the lens of a 4th grade school. I'm not a 4th grader, but I would think that I would not want to sit down in a class and just take down notes or listen to my teacher try and like list facts about peacemakers and and like efforts of peace building, which is interesting to me currently as a so as a sophomore, a second year, I guess. But for a fourth grader, it might be hard to sit down and pay attention to.
Absolutely. Ash, thank you. I just wanted to interject for a moment, hon. Thank you so much for all that you've shared. In the interests of time, just because I know we have another speaker, Professor Smith has another speaker. I just want to say that you guys pushed through those hardships, right, with the school. And I just want to say just to kind of move to conclusion, and I want to thank Ash for all he's shared, because as you can all see, this was quite the involved project. They went to this artistic website and found the illustrations. They got text on the several peacemakers, and I applaud Ash for all that he's done. And that was one of the challenges, was not hearing back from the schools, not knowing how to adapt college level material to a fourth grade class. But it was a great start, and I just want to just quickly and thank everybody and move to conclusion, so that we can have a little time for Q&A, and then I know we have another speaker. So let's see here, forgive me here. So that was where are we here? Yeah, so just to put a wrap on it, we have decided that going forward, we want to provide more mentoring to the students. Phil is getting more involved more frequently with the students. We are using more, we want to tap the Innovation Center more for a little bit more support. I have assigned the Global Security System book, so the students have that as a reference point. We've moved from group projects to partner projects where just two people are working together, which makes it a little bit easier for them to share the labor equally and so on. We're learning how to get the balance right between providing a framework for the students, do A, B, C, and D, which is easier sometimes for them, but it kind of quells their creative juices. So we're trying to find that balance between structure and innovation. And we're considering this as a standalone course because it's so involved that you could just work on these projects from September till December, right? Or January till May. It's very hard to kind of include the case studies. Daganawida, for example, was one case study. Gandhi was another. King was another. But I'll tell you, to do all that and then give the students enough time, right, to contact their organizations or their project contacts, and then hear back and have an interview and figure out how they can plug in. It takes weeks and weeks. So we did our best, and I'm excited for the future because I think we're refining it every semester. And by all means, if anyone has any questions or comments or wants to contact Phil or me or Ash for the copy of the report, we are working on this to publish. We're looking at transformative education as a journal for this work, and we really think it's groundbreaking. It just needs time to be refined. So I want to thank you all. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Susan,
Yeah.
Phil, and especially Ash. What a phenomenal project.
Yeah.
And so I commend you and Adelphi University for launching this. And Ash, I don't know, do you see yourself as a career in education? You see yourself as a teacher?
Well, I want to go down more to like psychology. So it'll be more like I want to be like a clinical psychologist. So
Okay.
it's a lot.
It's always great to see what students are doing. So I'm glad we focused on what you're doing and what you've been doing in class and so forth. That's just a great thing for us to all celebrate. So, I know I want to give everybody a couple of minutes because I do want to kind of keep on time, but at the end, I'm going to send everybody an email who presented. If they want to share their PowerPoints, we can share them within the group. I'm just kind of waiting to the end of the seminar to do that. So because I think Susan and Phil and Ashley put a lot of information really good in there. And if people want to share their contact information now, they certainly can do that. So we've got about 5 minutes. That's great. So I want people to get up and walk around if they want to do that. But if they've got a question or two, I'm going to hard stop it at 1:15. I've got 1:10. Questions for Susan, Ash, or Phil now. Other people want to get up and walk around, that's fine. We'll come back at 1:15. So just open your mic. It's just the easiest thing to do. Anybody got questions for what they're doing? Go ahead, Tulin. Yeah.
First of all, I want to commend you for the great work that you're doing. I also have a question. When you were discussing the interreligious peacemaking model, you only included the monotheistic traditions. I wonder if you would be interested also in including a tradition like Buddhism, where nonviolence is an essential element of the tradition, or the Society of Friends, or other traditions that emphasize nonviolence.
Thank you, Tulin. It's good to see you, by the way. I know we've met before. Yeah, I am all for that inclusion. And it may seem like we only included the monotheistic traditions, but in fact, we also included indigenous religions. And that's what, in fact, my students presented on last year at the Interfaith Center at Adelphi. They presented on indigenous wisdom. So we really did go that route. I also introduced them to Buddhism, to Sikh, to Quakers, to secular humanists. Yeah, I tried to make room for all of those, but the students chose indigenous wisdom for their project.
Thanks,
Right.
Tulin.
Yeah.
Other questions? We have a couple more minutes. Just go ahead and open your mic. Okay, then. Well, let's take a little bit of a break then. Looks like about 2 or 3 minutes, and we'll come back at 1:15, and I'll introduce our next speaker, and we'll go until about 2, and then have questions after that. Again, thank you, Susan, Phil. Nice to see both of you again. Nice to meet Ash.
Thank you.
Glad to be part of all of this. And it's always, like I said, it's so important to get the students to really be engaging. I'm really appreciative of elementary school. My daughter teaches 2nd grade. And this is directed to 4th grade, but she doesn't want me to get involved in what she teaches. My daughter is kind of like that, as most children are with their parents, but I'm always curious of how peace education is presented at the 2nd grade level. Eventually I'll have that conversation with her. Okay. All right. I'm going to mute myself, and we'll come back in another minute or 2, unless people want to sit around and chat, so we can sit around and talk. But I want to give Ozzy a chance to prepare, and then I'll introduce her in just a minute or 2. Okay. Great to see everybody again.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah. We have a lot of New Yorkers today. So Susan, Ash, and then Ozzy's from Queensborough Community College in New York. So we're heavy on New York today. So that's okay. Nassau Community College, Adelphi, Queensborough. So it's okay. Bring all the New Yorkers here. Stay out of trouble.
And Ozzy, it's good to see you. I know we met at David's seminar a few years back. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much. It's good to see you as well. I thought that your name looked familiar when I saw you in the Zoom. So yeah, I'm sorry that I wasn't able to be present for the entirety of your presentation. I have a little dog here that I was hoping to tire out with a walk before I started. So that way I wouldn't be distracted and he wouldn't make too much noise. I'm praying that he'll be well behaved for my talk here. So
Well, as the crow flies, you must not be that far from each other, between Nassau and Queensborough and Adelphi, right? You're all on the same island, right?
yeah.
We
Yeah.
are. Yeah, and
Yeah.
you and I followed up. I believe we followed up. If I went in my search and searched email, I could find you, and I'll get your info as well before we part ways today. And
I would love that. Yeah, I think do we have Greg in common? Is he one of your colleagues? Greg, God, why am I are you Nassau or you're Adelphi?
I'm both. I teach
Okay.
I teach every fall the intro to peace studies at Adelphi, and I
Okay.
teach a lot of other things at Nassau.
Yeah, because one of my former colleagues of Montgomery College ended up at Nassau, and I believe he's the chair now for psychology there, but maybe you haven't had an opportunity to cross paths with him yet. So I'm drawing a blank on his last name right now, which is very embarrassing. But I'll have to reach out to him after this and ask him if you're familiar to him.
I don't know a Greg from psychology, but I work very closely with a Stephen Greenbaum, who
Okay.
is I don't know if you know that name, but he's on my civic engagement committee. Very
Okay.
active, very active. And I could ask him about Greg. I don't,
Yeah.
but Greg doesn't ring a bell. Of course, there was a great peacemaker at Hofstra,
Mm,
Greg, but sadly he passed away all too soon.
okay.
And his last name is just going out of my mind, but
Yeah, I'm having one of those moments right now as well.
yeah, that might be, I don't know if that's who.
All
you're
right.
thinking.
All right, well, work on your moments. I get those moments too. We're going to come back and I'm going to turn it over to Ozzy. So welcome back, everyone. We are now in the last segment of our second session, which is the second of three. We will be back next weekend. So I welcome everybody back. Ozzy and I go back a ways because Ozzy was at Montgomery College the first time we ran this in 2013. And then she went off to New York, and that's where she's been ever since. And she continues to drop it, and I see her, and she's presented before and come before, so I'm really glad to see her. And when we did this at Montgomery College, we did it at Montgomery for 1 year, at Nova for 4 years, Northern Virginia College, George Mason for 2 years, and now we've been doing it virtually. But I know at Montgomery College, it was a big to-do. We had about 25, and it was filmed, and there's a lot going on, and you know, our size have gone up and down over the years, but I'm glad to see Ozzy. So Ozzy LA is associate professor with tenure of psychology at Queensborough Community College in New York City. She also serves as an adjunct in the MA program in psychology at NYU. She is the co-host of the Dark Side of Yoga podcast. That sounds intriguing. And serves, because I do yoga, so I have to if there's a dark side, I'll find out about it. Serves as a mindfulness consultant for small businesses. Her research interests presently focus on Holocaust education and the psychology of bystander behavior during the Holocaust. Past research is focused on the intersection of media, mass violence, warfare, and genocide. And she is the author of Understanding Aggression, Psychological Origins and Approaches to Aggressive Behavior. And I forgot to mention that you are a fellow. Tell me what what's the name of the?
Oh yeah, it's our Holocaust Resource Center, the Kupperberg Resource Center at Queensborough Community College.
Right.
Yeah.
And she's a fellow there also. So if everyone can mute themselves, I'm going to turn it over to Ozzy. She's going to have then the next 45 minutes. And we'll take it away. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. Let me see if I can share the screen. I do not have a very, it's not a super sophisticated PowerPoint relative to the last one that was there, but I just wanted to kind of highlight some of the questions that I wanted to grapple with. So let's see if we can I'm so bad at this. Let's start it from the beginning. There we go. Yay. All right. So I appreciate the introduction. It's nice to see some familiar faces. Tulin, it's good to see you as well. I remember from many years ago, we participated in these conferences together. I'm not sure, David, if you know this, but actually that conference, the original first kind of like really big conference that we co-hosted at Montgomery College, that was actually my entry point into peace building and conflict resolution. And so I really owe you a lot in terms of how that conference really broadened my perspective. And as I'm going to talk about today in terms of Holocaust education, that was my entry point because we did a lot of visits to institutions in DC prior to the conference going remotely. And we went to the Holocaust Museum one of the years. And that was a really kind of eye-opening experience for me in terms of recognizing that, you know, my area of expertise, so my background is I'm a social psychologist. And so I always came to teaching my students the Holocaust from the perspective of aggression, mass violence, and genocide. But then after the conference that I participated in multiple times, I started to expand the way that I would present the Holocaust, because I really see peace building and conflict resolution as the other side of the coin of what one of my areas of expertise are. So I wanted to thank you for that. So in terms of what I want to focus on today, I just wanted to present the group with a couple of preliminary questions on the screen to get us thinking about what we're going to be exploring. I find that it's helpful to start with these types of questions so that we can infuse intentionality into the session and think about what we want to get out of this time that we have together. So the first question that I want us to reflect on is, why does it matter to expose our students to peace building and conflict resolution? I wish that I had had more time to sit in on Ash's talk, because I think that his presentation probably did a great job of demonstrating the necessity of that type of work. And then the second piece of this is for us to think about what we do to stimulate change or growth for students in our classrooms, because what I suspect is that many of us are specifically exposing our students to peace building and conflict resolution with similar types of goals. Whether or not we're deliberate in terms of kind of constructing specific objectives or outcomes in terms of what we want our students to gain from these experiences. So where my entry point is in terms of my research is to kind of ask this question of how can Holocaust education serve as a bridge between peace building and conflict resolution, and also for transformational learning. So I think that a lot of us are engaging in these pedagogical tools to stimulate change or growth in our students. And again, we might not necessarily be deliberate or conscious of what we're trying to transmit to our students, but I think that a lot of times transformation is behind many of the things that we're creating, whether or not we realize it. With peace building and conflict resolution in particular, I think that the intention is to invite our students to consider a new perspective in terms of how they see the world around them and also their place in it. And I would argue that conflict resolution in particular is a skill that all of us can benefit from cultivating. And if we look at what's going on socio-culturally and politically right now, I think a conference like this, these types of dialogues, constructing specific curriculum is even more essential right now in terms of what we're living in culturally. So ideally, exposure to these types of topics for our students can offer them an alternative from however they might have been socialized prior to coming into our classroom. So for instance, I was talking a little bit during the break about, I'm full-time at Queensborough Community College. We're part of the larger City University New York system, and we're the most diverse of all the community campuses, but also as a community college, a lot of times we're our students' first exposure to higher education. And they come from very different backgrounds, and especially, I would say this likely resonates even for those of us that are in four-year universities or other educational institutions. Since the pandemic, a lot of our students are coming into the classroom with trauma. A lot of our students are dealing with significantly more stressors and challenges than pre-pandemic. And so I think one of the entry points for our students is that a lot of them could personally benefit from exposure to this type of content. And not only that, but I think that it's empowering to present our students to these topics as well, because it allows them to more actively engage in their environments and to really think about where they position themselves in terms of their place in the world and how they want to engage and interact with others. So the transformational learning literature in particular is an area of scholarship which is essentially looking at, as faculty, what are we doing or what can we be doing in the classroom to stimulate growth or change in our students? And I think that particularly with liberal arts education. And I would say, especially for those of us who are taking the time to get these additional types of exposures and to have our students exposed to peace education in particular, that a lot of us are coming from this intention of wanting to stimulate this kind of growth or change in our students. There's a lot of different ways that the literature defines transformational learning or identifies how we can measure it in our students. One of the descriptions that I really liked identifies it as a process that results in significant and irreversible changes in the way a person experiences, conceptualizes, and interacts with the world. So there are a lot of different descriptions in the literature regarding what constitutes transformative learning, but the takeaway here is that it's like a spark or some kind of trigger in the classroom that gets a student to start thinking about things differently than how they were thinking about them before. So, you know, some of the literature describes it as an aha moment, like it can be this kind of switch that flips where something shifts for the individual and they start to see things in a different way. But it's not necessarily always that visceral or easy to quantify. It can also, transformation can also occur in these kind of incremental shifts that occur over the course of a semester. It can be more of a kind of gradual maturation or growth as well. It's going to vary depending on the student, depending on the learning environment, depending on the particular course and things like that. But one thing that I really want to highlight, because this will become more relevant as we transition specifically into how Holocaust education can be a catalyst for this, is that, you know, obviously the notion of transformation or change is positive, but the kind of process that can lead to it can even be one of frustration or challenge for our students. And that's really important as well. The process of transformational learning is not always going to be one that's seamless. It can oftentimes be triggered by challenges that students are experiencing in the classroom. Maybe it's even frustration from the perspective of what they're being exposed to, or their ability to wrap their heads around something that maybe gets them to question what they believe to be true, which in the moment can feel really uncomfortable. But if we kind of work through those feelings, can actually significantly reflect that kind of transformation that we're seeking. And the reason that I wanted to highlight that is because I would say that as students and faculty, we have to embrace discomfort during the course of learning. And one of the things that I've really tried to work on as faculty is embracing ambiguity in terms of class content, and also feeling comfortable with not having all the answers, or not necessarily being able to wrap up content in a really neat way, depending on what we're covering. Something like Holocaust education is not easy material for students to work through. And particularly given that we have a lot of mythologies regarding the Holocaust that we're indoctrinated with as Americans in particular, oftentimes exposure to it in a college environment might be very different than how students previously were taught about the Holocaust in lower levels of their education, or even from the perspective of pop cultural representations of Holocaust education. And so there's no easy answers, and there's a lot of gray with a topic like the Holocaust as well. And so I think that if we get more comfortable with that discomfort, then we can try to create an environment in the classroom where there's not judgment, and that students can feel safe to kind of explore and not immediately shut down if they start to feel uncomfortable. I noticed that Ash mentions controversy near the end of his talk, and that's also something I'm really curious during the Q&A to get feedback regarding this. Something that I've noticed anecdotally within the last several years of teaching is that a lot of times it seems that students shy away from wanting to engage or participate in class discussions if the topics are perceived to be quote unquote controversial. And so there could be this kind of like uncomfortable tension or silence around topics where students are really afraid of saying something that could offend other students, for instance. And I think this is part of this like larger culture that we're living in right now, especially on social media platforms and things like that, where there's not a lot of leeway or room for mistakes or to openly say, I don't know this, like, I don't know what the right answer is. I'm not really sure how I feel about this. And so that can be a particular challenge when it comes to presenting content such as the Holocaust, because it can be very uncomfortable for students, and they might not necessarily want to confront that discomfort, particularly if we're presenting the topic in a way that's contrary to their prior expectations about it. But I would say that the kind of moments of frustration or even that palpable tension that could develop in classes, that is an indicator that we're on the right path, because, you know, growth, a lot of times the best growth comes from those uncomfortable conversations, comes from that conflict, comes from my perspective being contrary to someone else's perspective, and us kind of having a dialogue and talking through that and trying to understand where the other person's coming from. Higher education in particular has been identified in the literature as an opportune time for students to experience transformational learning, because you're generally dealing with a more mature population. You're dealing with adult learners, and also because there's not as much of an obligation when you're looking at higher education. Generally speaking, or relatively speaking, you're looking at a population of students that are choosing to be there. They're paying for their education, they're choosing what courses to enroll in. And so from a kind of incentive or motivation perspective, they are primed for that kind of transformation. And that maturation process is also critical because, you know, there's a lot of literature about Holocaust exposure. Beyond higher education, we can expose students to it earlier, but there are particular nuances and challenges that come when we're dealing with younger populations and this type of content. A key part of being a catalyst for transformation in the classroom is when students are presented with something in an innovative or new way. That it's oftentimes that fresh perspective that can lead to that trigger or spark where you start to see that growth or maturation, that kind of shift, if you will, in perspective. So I think, so I'm sorry, I already did that. What constitutes transformational learning? And then this question of specifically why the Holocaust? You know, how could this potentially be the pathway or the entry point? So when I started doing work on Holocaust education, as I mentioned, there's a lot of scholarship that's looking at, you know, curriculum, how to expose students to Holocaust. Then there's a separate kind of discipline of literature that's looking at pedagogy and what we can do to trigger transformation in our students and things like that. And one of the deficits that I noticed as David mentioned, I was a faculty fellow at our Holocaust Resource Center at QCC. And as I was developing a program to expose our student body to different lectures and seminars specifically about the Holocaust, I realized that there was this gap in the literature that a lot of faculty and researchers were talking about. This is why it's really important or essential or necessary to expose students in higher education to the Holocaust. And then there was this other segment of literature that was talking about, this is why it's important to try to transform our students in the classroom, and these are the things that we can do. But they were totally separate. And so the work that I did with my last publication is it was finding a bridge between the two, looking at how specifically could Holocaust education be the catalyst that then triggers that transformation or growth that we're seeking. And as I mentioned, I see exposure to the Holocaust as not only the other side of the peace building and conflict resolution coin, but also depending on how you present your students to the Holocaust, it could also very much be aligned within the same unit, because while there's certain narratives of the Holocaust that are very stereotypical or very well known by our students before they come into our classrooms, the resistance and the rescue efforts and the nonviolence that certain communities engaged in as the Nazi regime was going to power and in response to the Nazi regime's increasingly radicalized policies is a far lesser known part of the Holocaust education story. So you could potentially craft an entire unit just on rescue and resistance during the Holocaust within a context of a peace building and conflict resolution unit for your class. The scale and scope of the Holocaust are far reaching, and the extent to which we can infuse the lessons or the values associated with peace building and conflict resolution within those units, I think also lends itself to this type of exploration. The particular aspects of Holocaust education that I believe is very critical and that could potentially trigger this transformation, I wanted to take some time to identify, which includes how it resonates today. And one of them, and given that many of us are from New York, I think we can relate to this. There's a rise of anti-Semitism in the culture today. Just in New York alone, there's been a rise hate crimes across the board, but in particular, specifically crimes that are targeting individuals who are Jewish or who appear to be Jewish. And this is part of this larger trend that I think, you know, as educators and those of us that are housed within conflict resolution and peace building that we're very concerned with is this shift towards far-right extremism and authoritarianism and that kind of fragility of democracy that we're finding not only here in the United States, but across the globe. And so I think one of the necessities of exposing our college students to Holocaust education is because with the rise of anti-Semitism, we're also seeing a rise of Holocaust denial. And Holocaust denial really plays out in a number of insidious ways. And so if we want to insulate our students from being vulnerable to the type of rhetoric that we have pop cultural icons like, you know, very regularly mainstreaming in our culture today, I think that it's critical that our students understand and know the basic history of the Holocaust, which also includes features of Holocaust denial. So for instance, I think a lot of times when we hear Holocaust denial, we think extremes in terms of, let's say, the former president of Iran who never acknowledged its existence, for instance. But there's other kinds of less obvious or more insidious ways that denial takes root. And we've seen those examples on social media platforms in terms of, unfortunately, really common pop cultural tropes that I'm not going to lend credence to by specifically identifying, but it's part of a larger trend of what researchers refer to as both universalizing and trivializing the Holocaust. And what this means is that when the term Holocaust is used in any way other than referring to the industrial scale destruction of the Jewish people over the course of the 1930s through 1945 in Nazi Germany and occupied territories, that's a form of universalizing. So, far right GOP candidate that equates vaccine mandates with the Star of David, for instance. That would be an example of that universalizing of the Holocaust. And in the same way, that also trivializes the Holocaust because it downplays the specificity of that particular historical atrocity, as well as the significance of that catastrophic event historically. And for instance, another common way that Holocaust denial, and I was just having a conversation about this with other New Yorkers at a coffee shop yesterday, another way that this can play out is in attempts at silencing memory of the Holocaust. So as early as the 2000s, polls revealed that upwards of 62% of Germans were quote unquote fed up with hearing about crimes against the Jews, and that large portions of not only the German population, but more generally the European public similarly reported that Jewish people still talk too much about what happened to them in the Holocaust, and that essentially these respondents reported experiencing fatigue in terms of hearing about atrocities from this time in history. And when I saw these results, I was really struck by the numbers because this is pre-pandemic. This is earlier in the 2000s, but I also saw this interesting kind of parallel in terms of a very similar dialogue playing out in our culture today politically regarding responses to continued teaching of slavery and treatment of indigenous people, these like faux attacks on criminal race theory and all this thing that the extreme right, banning of books and like a lot of these types of practices, I would say are very similar forms of denial in terms of the specific history of atrocities that have occurred here in the United States. So because of this rise of anti-Semitism, because of the rise more generally of far-right extremism, because of how polarized we are as a society today. Sorry, I was just doing a quick time check. I would argue that these are all reasons why it's that much more essential to expose our students to the Holocaust. And applicability is also really critical. I'm sure you have all experienced this with your students, especially today when they're really fatigued and dealing with a lot of other things in their lives during class. Students want to be able to not only learn about history or theories in the classroom, but there's this urgency in terms of how can I apply this to my life? Why should I care about this? Why does this matter? And that's why I also think that peace building and conflict resolution in particular are so important and empowering for our students, because those are things that you can immediately implement in your life. My research is from the perspective of bystander behavior. So a lot of the trainings that we do at our Holocaust Resource Center are things for students like how can you become a more active bystander, or how can you become, there's in the literature today, they use this term upstander. So this notion of you are sensitive to how other people are being treated in shared spaces, and you've cultivated skills and ways of being an ally or an advocate for social justice in ways that doesn't threaten your safety, but that makes you feel as if you're making a difference in shared public spaces. And so we do these bystander, upstander trainings to kind of walk our students through, okay, if you see this on the subway, or if you hear this kind of bullying online, what are things that you would feel comfortable engaging in as a way to offer support or defend against the individual who's being targeted. And so that applicability piece, I think, is really critical. And we can also use that with Holocaust education, because a lot of students come into discussions of the Holocaust with this preconceived notion that it was inevitable or there's nothing that could have been done to stop it. And I would argue that that's one of the most dangerous assumptions that we can help them unlearn. And one of the ways to do that is to identify the gradual and incremental radicalization process of the Nazi regime, which is very parallel to many governments today that are also shifting away from democracy. So there's the specificity of what happened during that particular period in time, but then there's also that aspect of that shift away from democracy is something that resonates immediately right now in terms of what's happening here in the United States, but also globally as well. And from the perspective of offering the potential of that aha moment in our students, you know, students a lot of times think that they know about the Holocaust because it plays a really prominent role in popular culture, in terms of films that you can screen on Netflix, in terms of documentary series, in terms of literature, in terms of all these other pop cultural kind of offerings. But the reality of the Holocaust is that it's a lot messier, and it's a lot more challenging to understand than our students might come into it thinking. So they might come into it thinking like there's clear good guys, there's clear bad guys. And then when you start to expose them to the nuances, the scale and scope of how many camps there were, you know, the facts that Hitler's inner circle was not present at all of the thousands of camps, the fact that everyday individuals in occupied territories were contributing in some kind of way to the targeting of this particular population, that's when you start to get a little bit uncomfortable as a student. Or the fact that the United States closed their borders, for instance, the fact that FDR was very aware of the pogroms and the mass shootings and things like that, you know, so you start to talk about that kind of stuff, and all of a sudden the mythology and the pop cultural depictions and things like that, it comes up against the realities that bystanders were by and large silent and complicit, if not directly collaborative, and actually helping the Nazi regime. And that is something that's challenging for students to grapple with, but at the same time, that's something that's very eye-opening for them. And the same way that transformation can be incremental and gradual, I would say that Holocaust education is also something that doesn't necessarily ever end. If students have the opportunity to be exposed to it in a college setting, if there's a particular institution at the college, as I have at my full-time job, or affiliated or close to the area, as many of us have resources, particularly in the New York area, the idea of Holocaust education is that we can offer that entry point or exposure, that spark, if you will, and then there's a constant revisiting, a constant refining, a constant process and continuum of exposure to better understand it. For instance, I tell my students this all the time. In all the years that I've been teaching and learning about the Holocaust, if anything, I feel like I find myself grappling with more questions rather than answers. And actually, I have a quote I keep on my desk to remind me of this, where it's, you can only teach what you need to learn. So I feel like in a lot of ways, my interest in, you know, exposing students to Holocaust education is also coming from my own interest in better understanding and grappling with so many of the kinds of philosophical questions that are raised when we confront what I would argue is one of the most catastrophic events that occurred in the 20th century. And so I think also to allow for a dialogue with students in terms of, there's no way you're going to know everything about, I don't know everything about this either, but we can start to learn together, and that this is a process that you can continue even outside of the classroom or next semester, depending on what resources you have at your college, for instance. So let's get to the specific question that's on this slide in terms of the how. So how can this topic trigger transformation or growth? And also, how can we start to implement it? Let me do the implementation, because I think the question of how it could trigger transformation maybe has already been covered. So this is what I was explicitly studying when I was the scholar in residence at our resource center. The framework or the theoretical orientation with which we present the Holocaust to students is very critical. Ideally, they will be exposed to the Holocaust in a higher education setting in a way that allows for greater depth, for greater richness, and for greater complexity than how they were previously exposed to it. In order for us to do this as faculty in a way that's not overwhelming for ourselves or for our students, I would argue, is to develop a specific framework or orientation. So as a social psychologist, a lot of times my entry point was through aggression, mass violence, and genocide. And so it kind of like an application of all those theories. For those of you who want to house it within peace building and conflict resolution, as I mentioned earlier, that's where you get the opportunity to identify the rescue, the resistance efforts. Why weren't those more widespread? Why was the nonviolent measures more within the minority, for instance? What effect did they have? A lot of times students are really surprised to hear that the Nazi regime was very sensitive to public opinion and that they were very willing to shut down certain programs if they feared a public backlash. And there are instances of other radicalized Nazi policies that were essentially stopped because of public outcry. And this is surprising for students because I think the stereotype they have about the Nazi regime, a lot of that reinforced in terms of film is this notion of like an omnipresent regime that was everywhere and that, you know, no one felt comfortable speaking out and things like that. And when you break down the reality of what it was like to live in Nazi Germany and occupied territories for students, oftentimes they're really surprised to hear people were breaking rules. They were listening to the radio, they were telling jokes, they were putting flyers and caricatures and making fun of Hitler on pamphlets and things like that. And so when you start to talk about specific instances of resistance or speaking out in the regime and within specific communities, how that spread, that can be very eye-opening for students. And that could be your entry point from the perspective of peace building and conflict resolution. To override or challenge common mythologies is also important. So this notion of there were perpetrators, there were victims, and the perpetrators were all Nazis and they were evil. The victims were all one group and they were all innocent, and no nuance in terms of the in-between. And that in-between is bystanders, which includes the international community. That's really important as well, I would argue. And as I mentioned, this is a challenging topic because there aren't easy answers. It's not a unit that's going to be wrapped in a bow at the end. Like, you're not necessarily going to feel good when you finish this unit. So that's important for students to recognize as well, to kind of, as I mentioned, to get comfortable with that discomfort, if you will. To recognize that we're just starting a dialogue. But that likely the Holocaust exposure is going to continue even after our semester, for instance, and where there are those moments of frustration, or where there are those moments of feeling challenged, to work through them with students rather than shutting down, because those could be the particular moments where you can see that growth or maturation, for instance. The application piece, I would say, is also really important. If there are themes that we can use to identify what happens then to present day in a way that doesn't universalize or trivialize the Holocaust, for instance. Some of the specific theoretical frameworks that I can share, just to get you all thinking. One thing that I will mention is exposure to the Holocaust or Holocaust education on the college level. It's inherently interdisciplinary. I think a lot of times we might be skeptical to introduce our students to this topic unless we have a background in history, because we might feel like I'm not qualified to teach this. But the basic foundation in terms of history, we can acquire and learn. Beyond that, we can bring our own expertise into the theoretical orientation or perspective that we present for our students. So for instance, just some examples of this, we can present and package the Holocaust from the perspective of eugenics, from the perspective of looking at American racism. The Nazi regime was very influenced by American policies at the time towards not only Black Americans, but more generally in terms of immigrants and other groups, for instance. We can present it from the perspective of stereotypes, radicalization of institutionalized discrimination, in groups and out groups, entry points for anti-Semitism and things like that. Criminalization of the other. I have colleagues in criminal justice who expose their students to the Holocaust from the perspective of the Nuremberg laws and the institutional changes that happened within the regime that enabled them to tilt towards one that would eventually engage in mass genocide. Medical ethics, it's very commonly taught in our nursing program, believe it or not, here. From the perspective of a lot of students don't realize that the first groups that were targeted under the Nazi regime were those who were disabled, who were mentally ill. Actually, German citizens were targeted, deemed unworthy of life as part of that larger eugenics ideology. It was commonly referred to as the T4 program. That's my entry point in abnormal psychology, because we talk about the stigmatization of mental illness and how, if left unabated and radicalized, it can lead to literal euthanasia programs where you're targeting and killing patients with schizophrenia, as was the case under the Nazi regime. And the T4 program is also an interesting entry point. That's a program that the Nazis bowed to public pressure and largely shut down because of public outcry. And so that's also an example where resistance against that program by citizens, they still continued more than what was publicly disclosed, but it never went full-scale industrial the way that the targeted killings of the Jews did, in large part because there was too much public backlash. And so the regime bowed down to that pressure. As I mentioned, bystander behavior is one of my entry points, complicity and collaboration. Actually, the year of the conference, David, they had the complicity and collaboration exhibit at the Holocaust Memorial Museum. So that was really eye-opening to consider. What about the international community? What about groups within Germany that weren't Nazis and that weren't Jews? What role did they play in either facilitating or in insulating, protecting, resisting, or rescuing their fellow neighbors and Jews? I find that that's a really resonant theoretical orientation because we're all bystanders. And so there's this immediacy for students in terms of what we can do in our own communities or what we fail to do in our own communities, unfortunately. Media, propaganda, authoritarianism from a political science perspective, that could be threats to democracy. That could be the entry point. We've had a number of programs where we've looked at the Nazi regime from the perspective of sex and gender, because there were very particular roles that men versus women played within the regime. And also, unfortunately, we see during times of mass atrocity and genocide, the threats to female versus male victims, to gay victims, for instance, or trans victims, which that's a newer area of Holocaust research that's just kind of starting to take off in terms of recognizing individuals that were targeted because they didn't neatly fit into the kind of masculine and feminine stereotypical constructions that the Nazi regime promoted. Refugee crises, internment, liberation, border policies. That's another entry point, which really raises uncomfortable questions like, who is worthy of being saved? If we look at the border policies in the United States, for instance, who is worthy of being seen as a victim and worth saving? Which, you know, we have a huge humanitarian crisis right now in terms of immigration that's only gotten worse since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so a lot of these philosophical questions, they resonate. One of the most disturbing things I encountered when I was doing my own research regarding reparations for Holocaust survivors today is that there were Holocaust survivors in Ukraine that had to flee again recently because of another invasion to their homeland. So imagine surviving an atrocity like that in the 20th century, only to be taken out of your homelands again in this century. Final thing to wrap up, I think in terms of time, I wanted to leave time for questions. One of the most popular quotes that you see in the Holocaust education literature is, you know, one educator shares that he's been asked many times, how can you bear to teach the Holocaust? In which case he responds, how can we not? So really getting at that urgency or the necessity of teaching a topic like this, even when it's uncomfortable and even when we might end up with more questions than answers. And finally, I just want to share some resources. So David mentions the center that we have on my campus in Bayside. It's the Kupferberg Holocaust Resource Center. I have a general URL for our website, but then also specifically we have an online exhibit about internment that's all about the concentration camp system, the over 44,000 camps that were located throughout Nazi Germany and occupied territories. So that's a great resource for students and faculty alike, and you don't have to be a member of QCC to have access to that. The Holocaust Memorial Museum in DC, for those of you who are local, you've probably experienced this, but they have great archives online as well for educators in particular. They also have really great fellowship opportunities. So if you find yourself earlier in your journey as potentially wanting to develop more expertise as a Holocaust educator, I strongly recommend looking up their fellowship and research opportunities. I've done them more than once, and some of them are during the summer. So it could be very compatible with your schedules and your semesters. They're always looking for faculty that haven't participated before or who are new in terms of curriculum. And then I wanted to include my contact information as well. I can offer other resources. If I know specifically how you want to present the Holocaust and what your discipline and background is, then I can offer you more catered resources.
Thanks,
Thanks, everyone. I'm
Thank
going
you
to
so much.
unmute myself so that if
That's
anyone
all right.
has any
Let's-
questions.
Yeah, maybe if you can close your PowerPoint and stop sharing that, and then we can take a few minutes for questions. You know, one of the things that I just finished reading, this is such a tome, but felt like I had to read it. The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Shire. It's from 1960, and it was the classic.
One of the best books. Oh my God.
It's the
amazing.
classic
It's
narration
classic.
of the whole period of time. And it's troubling because of the parallels. It's time to read it because what you see happening in Germany in the 1930s and the movements and the propaganda and the misinformation and the complacency of the German people, we're seeing that all here too. And so it's really instructive. Now it's 1,200 pages. It takes a little bit to get through it.
Oh my God.
but
It's a Bible.
It is worth it. Yeah.
You
Any
know,
questions for Ozzy?
yeah.
So I just ask question. Will, do you want to ask your question? You just posted it.
Sure. So I am in a Cultural Foundations of Education program, and we teach a ethics and education course every spring. And this past spring, we read Asperger's Children, The Origins of Autism in Nazi Vienna. And it covered in a very thorough way how even within the German populations or the surrounding area populations, there was criminalization of mental health and what that looked like within those populations, but then how that was expanded out into a more like meso or even macro level throughout Nazi Germany. It's a good read. It's a depressing read, but it's a good read.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And I would also say that that's also part of the larger kind of ideology that the regime had in terms of expanding on popular theories within academia, including the United States at the time, in terms of eugenics and this idea of creating a more superior or quote unquote master race, and the notion of that kind of worthiness of life. That's really where it starts from, this idea of what qualities do we want to preserve, what qualities do we want to perpetuate, versus which ones are we going to specifically target and say that these are a burden on our society and they're not worthy of life. And then, you know, a lot of that is encompassed in that T4 program that I referred to, that then will become radicalized and taken even more to an extreme in terms of the smaller scale, and it's smaller scale, but it's still outrageous. The smaller scale euthanasia programs that they do on these groups, then on an industrial scale, are going to be perpetrated and applied to the entire Jewish population of Europe. And so that in a lot of ways is the kind of impetus, but then it also reveals a lot about the underlying ideology of the regime, which I think is very, very insightful. Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, for your question. Other questions for Ozzy while we have her here?
Ozzy,
Anything?
I loved the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, a lot of rich information. I appreciated all your multidisciplinary lenses that you provided. So on the peace building lens, which is the lens I use when I do the Holocaust education part of my class. And again, I changed my intro class a lot. We didn't do much in the way of Holocaust education in Ash's class, but I have done Sophie Scholl, the film before, and talked about the White Rose and about the student resistance movement. But my question for you on that lens is, when you do rescue and resistance as a lens, and then talk about, well, yes, there were these efforts made that we need to learn and see that this was happening, both within Germany and outside Germany, and within Jews who did resistance and Catholics and others who did amazing sacrifices. But then ultimately those rescues, they don't measure up. I mean, they kind of pale, I hate to say that, in comparison to, you know, the gross atrocities that were eventually committed. So how do you present that? Do you say that, well, those who were conforming and compliant and who did not resist just eventually exceeded the number of resistors? How do you set that up? I'm just wondering.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So one of the ways that I set up, because my lens is psychological, regardless of what specific, theory I'm presenting. So one of the ways that I just present in general, risk factors or factors that facilitate genocide within a society is this kind of continuum of destruction, where you see the gradual incremental increase and escalation of violent or extreme behaviors and policies that are perpetuated by the regime. And this is commonly referred to as a continuum of destruction in the genocide literature. You can look up like the 8 stages of genocide. I think they've expanded it since 8, but the point is that there's like this escalation that you see across the board, not specific to the Holocaust, but you can use the Holocaust as your frame of reference, where the regime was very sensitive, as I mentioned, to public opinion. So as they would pass policies that would strip Jews away, strip their rights away, they would look to see, how is the population responding? How is the international community responding? And if there wasn't that requisite outrage or backlash, then you would see more and more of an extremism in terms of their policies. And so the entry point for rescue and resistance efforts is the same way that there's a continuum of destruction. There's also a continuum of helping behaviors or the former head of Yad Vashem, when he came to our center, he referred to it as the simplicity of kindness or helping. So small acts of resistance, particularly when the regime is early on in terms of their own continuum, can go a long way towards stopping or defending against other forms of radicalization. And so, for instance, you could use the example of the Star of David in Denmark. The leaders were basically like, no, we're not putting it on our Jewish population. And so they would not allow for that initial separation. And so there weren't the same requisite types of lists in terms of this is the part of the population that is Jewish versus the French are willingly offering these lists, the other occupied. And so when you got that resistance early on, Denmark, they saved virtually all of their Jews. And the means that they used were largely nonviolent means. America, early on, there were pockets of resistance that were calling for boycotting German goods. And early on, that could have had a huge blow to the regime because so much of Hitler's platform was based on this economic revival. And so there's been a lot of scholarship regarding if that boycott had persisted for longer, and if more than just pockets in the United States engaged in that, would that have put more international pressure on the regime to scale back the violence? And so you can look at it as two sides of the same coin. You have continuum of destruction on one side, and then you have the simplicity of goodness or helping behaviors on the other side. Small scale acts of resistance early on are going to stop the regime from the radicalization process. If you wait until you have the mass shootings or you're deporting and you already have the camp system in place, which is essentially what happens, it's too late. So that's why the only examples that we have of rescue or resistance are within these subcultures or within particular occupied territories, because there wasn't a larger scale global response immediately that could have stopped. But there are instances and specific examples, like you can look up the community in Le Chambon in France, for instance, that did a resistance effort. That's probably one of the greatest ones. But a really important point, final thing I'll mention is it's important not to expose students to rescue and resistance as if it was extraordinary. Because if they see it as being extraordinary, then they see it as being exceptional and they see it as not being the norm.
Yeah.
And the community in Le Chambon, they have been hypersensitive to not wanting any kind of recognition. And there's different documentaries or footage that you can show of specific community members being interviewed. And one of the things that you see, they're a very humble community, but they're basically like, we just did what anyone. That's one of the most common thing you hear from rescuers. I just did what anyone would have done in my shoes. So I think we also have to, the same way that evil is elevated and there's this sense of like evil is like this monstrosity.
Yeah.
And, you know, we have the banality of evil. There's also the banality of helping. And I think it's really important to demystify the helping so that we recognize that we are all capable of engaging in those types of acts of rescue and resistance as well, that you don't have to be a Gandhi or an MLK, for instance, to offer those nonviolent tactics, for instance.
Okay, I'm going to have to call it a day.
Sure.
It's all right. No, it's good to have some questions afterwards. If people have other questions, just contact Ozzy directly. We will be back again next Friday at 12 noon. We're going to look at extremism. We're going to look at climate change next week. We're going to look at a couple other more existential type issues also. So I'll see you all back next week. Priscilla will send you links. Thank you, Ozzy. Thank you, Susan.
Thanks for the
Ash.
opportunity, David.
I think Phil left. Thank you, Phil. Thank you all for being here. I will say adieu. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. And then we'll be back here next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, Dave. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Great to see your faces.